Mark is my name. It all began when my friends and I decided to rent a cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxing time to catch up and take a break from our busy lives. I'm 28 years old, and until a year ago, I didn't believe in anything paranormal, ghosts, curses, haunted places, or anything like that. However, after what happened in that cabin, I've changed. I don't tell people about this much because most people wouldn't believe me, but I feel compelled to share it, even if it's just to get it off my chest. Greg, since college, Emma and Tom had been friends, but as time passed, our friendship waned. This vacation was intended to reunite us. Greg discovered the cabin online. It seemed to be a comfortable little spot tucked away in the woods with a porch and a fire pit, and there was not a neighbor in sight. The price was far less than we anticipated, which at the time seemed like a benefit, but now I see that it should have been a caution. The ad talked about the serene setting and the breathtaking views of the surrounding forest. We loaded our luggage, food, and enough alcohol for the weekend into my old SUV and set off early on a Friday morning. The journey took around 5 hours, and as we approached the cabin, the scenery changed. The trees' branches thickened and they became higher, and the sunlight appeared to fight to reach the canopy above us. The road shrunk to one lane, and there were no homes, automobiles, or indications of life. Nothing. It was late afternoon when we got there, and the cabin looked just like the pictures. It was small, rusted, had a sloped roof, and a small porch, but I couldn't get rid of the eerie feeling that something wasn't right. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, and there was a strange silence around us. No birds, no rustling leaves. Is this setting a touch eerie, or is it just me? Emma inquired, her voice scarcely audible above a whisper, as she got out of the vehicle. Greg tried to lighten the situation by laughing, and it worked well. The cabin was simple, with a large room, a small kitchen, a living area with an old couch and a fireplace, and 2 bedrooms in the back. It smelled like wood and dust, as if it hadn't been used in a long time. The furniture was sturdy but old, and there were a few paintings of forests and mountains on the walls. We're in the middle of nowhere, with no noise, no stress, just peace and quiet. I nodded, but the unease in my stomach wouldn't go away. The sun was beginning to set behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground, but we didn't mind as we walked. The silence was eerie, and I couldn't get rid of the feeling that we were being watched. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something moving out of the corner of my eye, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. We decided to explore the area after we settled in. There was a small trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods, and we thought it would be a good way to stretch our legs after the long drive. Tom asked in a strained voice. Greg and I cracked open a few beers while Emma prepared dinner, and for a short while it felt like things were back to normal as we laughed, joked, and reminisced about our college days. However, as the evening wore on, the atmosphere changed as the fire crackled in the fireplace, casting flickering lights. Greg laughed, but there was an edge to it. It's just the woods, man. They can play tricks on you. Tom wasn't convinced, so I'm serious. After that, we all fell silent, scanning the trees as we continued down the trail, and the more intense the feeling became. The cabin seemed to be groaning and shifting beneath an unseen weight as the wind outside started howling and shaking the windows, and shortly after midnight, we heard. At first, the faint scratching sound coming from the rear door seemed like something rubbing against the wood, and we all stopped, staring at the door. What the devil was Emma whispering, her face becoming pale. Greg is always the courageous. We all held our breath expecting for him to say anything, but he simply stood there peering into the night after getting up and grabbing a flashlight, possibly from a tree or something else, and gently opening the door to shine it into the darkness. I said, my voice scarcely audible, "What do you see?" "There's nothing out there," Greg said, his voice shaky, "but I swear I thought I saw something moving." We all exchanged uncomfortable looks, and the tension in the room became unbearable. Greg didn't respond. He just stood there, the beam of light trembling in his hand. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he slowly backed away from the door and shut it. There was a problem. That night, someone was watching us, and none of us slept well. Every sound, even creaks and wind gusts, made my pulse race. The following day, we tried to get rid of the fear by spending the morning fishing by the lake in the hopes that being outside in the daylight would help us relax, but it never really went away. I kept seeing the tree line, half expecting to see something hiding in the shadows. I kept seeing something creeping through the woods, getting closer to the cabin, waiting for the right moment to strike. The sky had already darkened by the time we returned to the cabin, and as we got to the front porch, I noticed something odd. The ground around the cabin appeared disturbed, as if someone or something had been walking around its perimeter. The dirt was scuffed, and there were odd marks that resembled claw prints but were too big to be any animal I could think of. "Did you guys notice this?" I called out, pointing to the ground, and Emma and Tom came over. Their faces were filled with confusion, and Tom's voice was shaky. Greg's forehead was wrinkled in contemplation. That night was even worse than the first. The wind howled louder and the scratching at the back door returned, making it seem like whatever was out there was trying to get in. We all huddled together in the living room, and every light in the cabin turned on as if that would somehow keep us safe. No one wanted to check the door again because we were too afraid to move, and just after midnight, the scratching stopped for a moment. I don't know, maybe it was A.B. Bear, but I didn't think the prince was too strange or planned. We all exhaled in relief when there was a pause, but it was brief because then there was a loud bang that shook the cabin and made the walls tremble. It sounded like something had struck the side of the house with such force that we all leaped to our feet, our eyes wide with fear. "What the hell was Emma crying, Emma?" "We shouldn't remain here, I suppose," I said, my pulse thumping in my chest. Greg nodded, his face pale, and we decided it was time to leave. We gathered our belongings as fast as we could, not caring to pack neatly or to leave anything behind, and as we hurried out the front door and into the car, I took one last look back at the cabin and saw a dark figure standing just beyond the tree line. Its eyes were glowing faintly in the darkness, and it was too tall to be human, and its shape was wrong, twisted, and unnatural. The others had also seen it, so I didn't say anything. They had already. We drove down the narrow dirt road, never looking back, and didn't stop until we were miles away. We never discussed what had happened, and we simply decided that whatever was in that forest or watching us from the shadows, I never wanted to see it again. The hut at the edge of the forest is a location I will always remember, but I will never go back there, and I really hope you never do either. I couldn't find anything out of the ordinary, so I figured maybe I had dreamed it. I spent the day hiking a bit further up into the mountains, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Something about the quietness of the woods, how empty and still it felt, made me uncomfortable. That night I went into my tent earlier hoping a good night's sleep would help me forget about it, but in the middle of the night I woke up again, to the same sound. This time it was even closer, right outside the tent, a slow, dragging noise like something heavy being pulled across the ground. I stayed still, listening, barely breathing. The sound slowly moved around the tent, circling it. I could feel the ground slightly shaking beneath me. With each pass felt like it went on forever. Finally the sound faded away into the woods. I stayed awake until the sun came up, listening, but the forest had gone dead silent again. The next morning I decided I'd had enough and wanted to leave early. As I was taking down my tent, I noticed something strange in the dirt around where my tent had been. There were deep, smooth grooves, like something heavy had been dragged around the campsite. The marks were wide and didn't look natural. There were no footprints or signs of any animals, just the strange dragging lines that led into the woods. Curious, I followed the trail. It led deeper into the forest, weaving between the trees. I walked for a while, until I came to a small clearing. The first there didn't seem to be anything there, just an empty patch of dirt, but then I saw a large heavy stone, smooth and round, sitting in the middle of the clearing. The ground around it was messed up, like the stone had been dragged through the dirt, just like the marks back at my campsite. It didn't make any sense. There was no reason for it to be here, no sign of people, no explanation for how such a huge stone could have moved. It looked like someone or something had been dragging it through the forest. I backed away, my heart pounding, and hurried back to the campsite. As I packed up my gear, my hands were shaking. I just wanted to get out of there. As I was finishing up, I heard it again, the dragging noise, faint but growing louder, coming from the direction of the clearing. It was heading my way. I didn't look back. I grabbed my stuff and took off, walking as fast as I could without running. I didn't stop until I was far away from that place. I don't know what I saw, and I don't know what was out there with me, but the way that stone had been moved, the way that sound followed me, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't human. Something was watching me, something that didn't want me to see it, and I still wonder what might have happened if I hadn't left when I did. I'm a Canadian cop, and last summer I decided to spend a weekend camping alone in the wild. I picked a secluded spot deep in the woods, far from any trails, hoping for some real peace and quiet. The place was beautiful, tall pines, a calm lake, and just the sounds of the forest. I set up my tent and started a fire to cook dinner. As the sun went down, the forest grew dark, and the usual quiet was sometimes broken by the sound of leaves rustling. I felt pretty relaxed, knowing I was ready for anything and used to being out here alone. Around midnight, I was woken up by a soft, steady tapping on my tent. At first I thought it was just branches moving in the wind, or maybe a small animal, but then the tapping got louder and more rhythmic. It was coming from different sides of the tent, and it felt too organized to be random. My instincts kicked in, and I grabbed my flashlight and gun. Even though I was off duty, I slowly unzipped the tent and shone my flashlight around. There was nothing there. The forest was quiet. I stepped outside and checked the area. Everything seemed fine, but I noticed something odd. The ground around my tent was disturbed, like someone had walked around it carefully, staying out of the light from the fire. My heart was pounding, but I tried to stay cool. I decided to check it out, keeping my flashlight and gun ready. As I walked around, I found small footprints in the dirt, bare footprints. They were fresh, and the fact that there were no shoes meant someone had been trying hard to stay hidden. I followed the tracks, keeping my distance and moving quietly. They led me to the edge of the lake, and what I saw there made my blood run cold. Across the lake, I saw a figure standing among the trees, barely visible in the dim light. The figure didn't move, almost like it was watching me. A chill went down my spine. I knew I had to get out of there. I hurried back to my camp, packed up quickly, and got into my vehicle. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone behind me. The figure was gone, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me. Back home, I reported the strange events to the local police, but no one was ever found in that area. The footprints And the odd disturbances around my tent were never explained. It was a harsh reminder that even in the most isolated places, you're never truly alone. The unsettling reality is that someone or something was out there watching and waiting. My mom and I planned a camping trip by this quiet lake we'd been to before. It wasn't far, only an hour's drive from home, deep in the woods. We liked it because it was calm and no one else went there, so we felt safe even though it was far from everything. The first day went smoothly. We set up the tent, got a fire going, and spent the day sitting by the water. The air was fresh and it was quiet, not a single person around for miles. Felt nice, like we had the whole place to ourselves. When night came, we climbed into our sleeping bags. I could hear the soft sounds of the forest outside, leaves rustling, a few crickets. It helped me fall asleep fast. But sometime during the night, I woke up. The fire had gone out and it was completely dark inside the tent. The only light came from the moon outside, but even that was faint. As I lay there, I heard a noise outside the tent. At first I thought it was just the wind in the trees, but then I realized it was something else, something closer. It sounded like something moving through the bushes near us. I stayed still, listening hard, trying to figure out what it was. My heart was beating fast, but I didn't want to move then. In the summer of 1987, my grandmother thought it'd be a good idea for us to go camping. She said I needed to spend more time outdoors instead of sitting inside playing video games. I didn't really mind. She had an old beat-up tent, a rusty lantern, and a cooler packed with sandwiches. This kind of trip was right up her alley, simple and no extras. We drove out to a state park that was about 2 hours from her house. We set up our tent near a lake in a spot where only a few other people were camping, scattered far enough away that it felt like we were alone. The first day was normal. We walked around checking out some trails, ate sandwiches by the water, and I helped her build a small fire. As the sun went down, the woods around us got dark fast. The trees swallowed up the last bits of light, and soon it was just the fire and the stars. I was used to it being that dark, but my grandmother didn't seem to care. She was a tough woman, never afraid of anything. That night, though, I couldn't sleep. The forest was alive with strange sounds, branches cracking, leaves rustling, and what I swore sounded like footsteps far off in the distance. I kept telling myself it was just animals, but something about it didn't feel right. I lay there for hours, staring up at the inside of the tent, listening to every little noise. My grandmother slept peacefully next to me, breathing slow and steady in her sleeping bag, totally unaware. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. I told myself I was just letting my imagination get to me. We spent the day fishing and cooking over the fire, but when the sun went down, the noises came back, and this time they were closer. I lay in my sleeping bag, my heart racing as I listened to the sounds outside the tent. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was out there watching us from the darkness. By the third night, I was on edge. Every little sound made me jump. I tried to act like it was all in my head, but the feeling wouldn't go away. After we got into our sleeping bags, I lay there trying to calm myself down. Then I heard it again, a soft, slow crunching of leaves right outside the tent. My whole body tensed up. I stopped breathing, straining my ears to listen. The footsteps were slow, almost careful, like whoever it was didn't want to be noticed. They circled around the tent close enough that I could feel the ground move under me. I didn't dare move. I wanted to wake my grandmother, but I was too scared to even whisper. The footsteps stopped right next to my side of the tent, and for a long moment everything went quiet. Then something pressed against the side of the tent right where my head was. I felt it drag down slowly, like a hand brushing along the fabric. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. I lay there frozen, waiting for whatever it was to make its next move. After what felt like forever, the sound of footsteps came back, this time moving away from the tent. I didn't move for a long time, just staring into the darkness, too afraid to close I must have eventually passed out from exhaustion, but it wasn't restful. The next morning I woke up to the smell of coffee. My grandmother was already outside stirring the fire like nothing had happened. I got dressed quickly and stepped out of the tent. My mind was racing, going over everything from the night before. I walked around the tent looking for any sign of what had been out there. At first everything seemed normal, just leaves and dirt, but then I saw them deep footprints in the ground. Much too big to be from any animal. They led from the woods straight to our tent and stopped exactly where I'd felt the pressure on the fabric. But it wasn't the footprints that made my stomach turn, it was the fact that they didn't lead back into the woods. There were no tracks leaving our campsite, just the ones that came in. Something or someone had walked up to our tent and never left. I didn't say anything to my grandmother. We packed up camp and left that morning. I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints on the drive home. No matter how hard I tried to forget, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something had been there with us, watching us. And to this day, every time I think about that night, I wonder where they went, or worse, if they're still out there following me, waiting for the right time to come back. We were camped out in the middle of nowhere for a training exercise deep in the mountains. It was supposed to be an easy army trip, nothing big. We set up our tents close to the woods where the trees were thick and the air felt cold. You could smell the pine trees all around us. It was so quiet out there that you could almost forget how far we were from anything. The first night went all right. We did the usual stuff, set up our tents, ate some quick meals, and kept watch around the camp. But by the second night, something didn't feel right. It wasn't the usual feeling of being out in the wild. It was different, like something was off, but I couldn't figure out what. I was on guard duty, walking, looking around the camp, when I started hearing noises. At first I thought it was just the wind, but it didn't sound like that. It was more like someone or something moving around in the woods just outside of where the trees started. I looked into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. The moonlight barely got through the branches, making it tough to see far into the forest. I told myself it was probably just animals. Still, that creepy feeling stuck with me the rest of the night. When my shift ended, I went back to my tent, but I couldn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, it felt like someone was watching me. By the third night, everyone else seemed tense too. No one was saying anything, but I could tell the way they moved, the way they kept looking at the woods. It was clear something was bothering them. The air felt heavier that night, like something was in the woods keeping an eye on us. That night I heard the noise again. This time it was closer. I grabbed my gear and stepped out of my tent. Some of the others were already awake, standing by the campfire looking into the trees. I knew they had heard it too. We all stood still listening. The sound came again, moving closer. It wasn't an animal. Whatever was out there was bigger, and it was moving slowly, like it didn't want us to hear it. My heart was racing as I stared into the trees, trying to see what it was, but I couldn't make out anything. Then behind me I heard something in the bushes. I still don't understand why we chose to go there. It was meant to be a weekend escape where we could unwind and forget about our busy lives. But that cabin in the woods changed everything. My friend Mike discovered the location online and told us it was ideal, displaying images of the quaint little cabin encircled by trees. No self-service, no Wi-Fi. We packed our bags and drove out to the middle of nowhere, excited for a weekend of relaxation. The drive was long, and the farther we went, the more isolated the road became, with tall, dark trees lining it. At first, it seemed like a dream, just us in nature, where we could escape the constant noise of the city and enjoy some peace and quiet. It was already late afternoon when we arrived at the cabin, and the shadows of the forest were spreading farther across the ground. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures, small and rustic, with towering trees surrounding it. There was a small porch with a few old rocking chairs, and the windows were covered in thin white curtains that fluttered in the breeze. However, as soon as we got out of the car, I felt a chill go down my spine because the air was so quiet, as if the forest was holding its breath. There were no birds chirping or leaves rustling, just a creepy silence. Sarah, who was usually the watchful one in our group, mumbled as she picked up her luggage, and I could sense the uneasiness in her eyes. After all, it's just a cabin. Mike laughed, slapping her on the back. You're letting your imagination get the best of you. We unloaded our bags and headed inside. The cabin was simple: a small living room with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. It smelled like wood and dust, like it hadn't been used in a long time. That first night we sat around the fireplace talking and laughing like we always did, but as the hours passed and the fire died down, the mood began to shift. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, and the silence outside became more oppressive. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself that it was just the isolation getting to me. But then late at night I heard something. It started as a soft creaking sound like footsteps on old wood. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, trying to listen. The cabin was pitch black, with only the faint glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. The creaking grew louder, closer. It was coming from the hallway, just outside my bedroom door. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to hear, afraid to move. Then the doorknob slowly turned. I froze, watching as the door inched open. A sliver of the room was filled with moonlight, lighting the entrance. Mike was a towering, gloomy, motionless figure who I could just make out standing there. I trembled and whispered, but the figure remained still and motionless, as if it were observing me. My body would not move, even though I wanted to scream to get out of that bed and go. Then, as abruptly as it had been, the figure retreated and vanished into the night. The door creaked shut, and I was left alone in the silent room, shaking with fear. The next morning I told the others what happened, but they brushed it off. Mike said it was probably just a dream, and Sarah suggested it could have been the wind, but I knew what I saw. That figure was real. The second night was worse. We were all on edge. The cheerful atmosphere from the first day long gone. Every little noise seemed amplified in the stillness of the cabin, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Around midnight the creaking started again. This time it was louder, echoing through the cabin like something heavy was moving across the floor. We all heard it. Mike grabbed a flashlight and led the way down the hallway, his hand shaking as he pointed the beam of light ahead. The creaking stopped just outside the living room. We stood there staring at the empty space, our hearts pounding in our chests. There was no one there, but the air felt thick with tension, like we weren't alone. Suddenly the rocking chair on the porch began to move, creaking back and forth slowly. We all jumped, staring at the door that led outside. The chair rocked on its own, even though there was no wind. What the hell is going on? Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. None of us had an answer. That night none of us slept. We huddled together in the living room, keeping the flashlight on and the fire burning. Every creak, every whisper of wind outside sent us into a panic. We were all thinking the same thing. We needed to leave, but it was too dark to risk driving through the forest at night. The next morning, as soon as the sun rose, we packed our things and left the cabin. The drive back felt endless, the trees closing in around us as if the forest didn't want to let us go. When we finally made it back to civilization, none of us spoke about what happened. We were just happy to be out of that place. But the memory of that cabin, of the figure in the doorway, and the rocking chair that moved on its own still haunts me. All I know is that we will never return to that cabin again. But I have no idea what we experienced in those woods, and I don't want to know. I heard it again, a dragging sound, low and slow, like something was being pulled across the ground. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just a deer or some animal, but the noise kept coming closer, slowly making its way around the tent. I looked at my mom, who was still asleep next to me. I didn't want to wake her up and make her scared if it was nothing, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. Suddenly the tent moved. It wasn't a big movement, just a slight push, but enough to make my stomach twist. Whatever was out there had brushed against the side of the tent. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. I didn't move, just listening, waiting for it to happen again, but nothing happened for a while. Then, after what felt like forever, I heard soft footsteps, faint at first, then getting quieter as they moved back into the woods. I lay there, eyes wide open, not daring to close them again. I stayed like that until morning, listening to every little noise, waiting for it to come back, but it never did. By the time the sun came up, I had almost convinced myself. I imagined that maybe it was just the wind after all, or maybe I was dreaming and woke up in the middle of it. My mom didn't say anything about hearing noises, so I didn't bring it up. We spent the day fishing and hiking, but I couldn't shake this feeling that something wasn't right. Every time I looked at the trees, I felt like there were eyes on us, like someone or something was watching. But I kept quiet. I didn't want to scare my mom or ruin the trip. The second night, I barely slept. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow seemed bigger. I lay there with my eyes open most of the night, just waiting, but nothing happened. It was almost too quiet, and that made me even more nervous. When the morning came, I felt a wave of relief. We packed up quickly, eager to get out of there. As we loaded up the car, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Right outside where our tent had been, there were deep, long drag marks in the dirt. They led from the trees right up to our tent and then back into the woods. I didn't say anything to my mom, but I couldn't stop staring at those marks. They were way too big to be from any animal. I knew it looked like something heavy had been dragged around our tent in the middle of the night. Right when I heard those sounds, we left, and as we drove off, I kept looking back at the woods, expecting to see someone or something standing at the edge watching us go. But there was nothing. The trees looked empty now. Every time I think about that night, I feel a deep chill run down my spine. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just passing by. It had come right up to our tent, close enough to touch us, and it left without a trace. But the worst part, one can't stop wondering why it left, or if it'll come back the next time someone camps there. I decided to take my stepbrother Mark out for a camping trip. We were both excited about it. The plan was to head to a remote spot deep in the woods, far from other people. I thought it would be a good chance for us to bond and escape our busy lives. We got to the site in the early afternoon. It was a quiet, out-of-the-way place by a small lake surrounded by thick trees. The place was perfect, isolated, peaceful, and far from any other campers. We set up our tent, built a fire, and spent the evening cooking over it. The night was cool, but nothing too unusual. Around midnight, after Mark had fallen asleep, I was lying in the tent looking at the faint light of the lantern. The sounds of the forest were soothing, except for one thing, a steady, distant thud. It sounded like someone was hitting something, or a muffled drum beat. At first I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just an echo or some animal, but as the hours went by, the sound got louder and more urgent. It was coming from the direction of the trees not far from our campsite. I tried to wake Mark, but he was deep in sleep, and shaking him only made him mumble, feeling more curious and uneasy. I decided to check it out. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The night was dark, and the thing seemed to grow louder as I walked toward the forest. My flashlight cut through the darkness, casting creepy shadows on the trees. The thud was now mixed with a strange scraping noise. I moved carefully, shining my flashlight around. The noise seemed to come from near an old half-buried tree stump. As I got closer, I saw a broken wooden crate partly hidden under leaves and dirt. It was the source of the scraping sound. I was about to look closer when I noticed something strange about the crate. It was covered in what looked like dried mud and old blood. My heart raced. I felt a shiver down my spine as I realized this crate hadn't just been left here, it had been purposely hidden. I pulled at the crate, and it came loose with a groan. Inside there was a small rusty metal box. I hesitated, but finally opened it. Inside I found old photographs and personal items, most of them with people's faces scratched out or covered up. A chilling feeling washed over me. It was clear this box didn't belong here and the stuff inside was deeply unsettling. I quickly closed the box and buried it again as best as I could, my mind racing with thoughts. I returned to the tent trying to stay calm and not wake Mark. The next morning, I packed up our stuff eager to leave the place. I didn't tell Mark about the crate. I thought it was better not to scare him. We left the campsite without any trouble, and the drive back was quiet. As I looked back at the forest from the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had uncovered something deeply disturbing. It wasn't just the crate or the strange noise, it was the unsettling thought that whatever was hidden in that box was meant to stay buried. The forest seemed to watch us as we drove away, like it was holding its breath, waiting for us to leave. I couldn't escape the sense that we had been watched, and that we had left something behind, something that didn't want to be found. The unease lingered long after we were gone, and I knew that whatever we had stumbled upon was still out there waiting in the shadows. When I was a kid, my grandparents had a cabin, and they would let my parents as well as aunts and uncles use it all the time. It was about an hour away from our house, and it was always fun to go up there. The cabin itself was pretty big, however there was no electricity or plumbing, so as a kid that always bothered me. My family went up there for a weekend once when I was 10. I remember that we had a pretty big amount of land with the cabin itself, and I am not even sure if there were any other cabins nearby at all. My family is kind of big. I am the youngest, and I have 3 brothers and 2 sisters, and then both of my parents were there as well. When we got to the cabin, we started playing games outside and that kind of stuff. My dad brought some burgers and hot dogs to grill, and after dinner we had a campfire and sat around it having a s'more. At one point I really had to go to the bathroom, which unfortunately we had to use the woods, for I had gone earlier in the day, but now it was nighttime. I was sort of scared to go into the woods by myself, but I was also shy going to the bathroom near other people when I was that age, so I didn't want to just duck behind a tree. I walked out down a path that led into the woods, and when I could no longer hear the talking of my siblings, I felt comfortable enough. I took a few steps into the woods, and when afterwards I walked back to the path and immediately heard noises of brush and leaves moving from about 20 feet away on the other side of the path in the woods. I thought it was possibly an animal like a deer because it sounded big. I started to run back on the trail, but I heard whatever it was moving towards me, as well as if it was trying to pass me. I stopped and froze in my place. I thought whatever animal was there would cross the path ahead of me, but instead it stopped just short of the path. I watched the area where I had heard the noise intently. Then I noticed what appeared to be a person hiding behind a tree. All I saw was the face, but it looked like some guy watching me from behind a tree in our woods. The way he seemed to be looking at me really freaked me out, like he was insane or something. I sprinted all the way back without looking. I got back to I told my parents that I had seen a guy in the woods, but they didn't seem to believe me at first because I was the youngest child. All I remember is my dad telling me that the property my grandparents owned was very big, and there was very little chance that anyone else would be out there. To cheer me up, he went back to the spot on the trail where I had seen the guy, but by this time, he was gone, and we didn't hear anything, so we went back, and I felt better now that I was with everyone and not alone in the woods any longer. I had a few s'mores by the fire, and then we all went inside the cabin to bed. There were a few bedrooms with bunk beds, so everyone had a place to sleep without TV or video games. And since this was before most smartphones, we all essentially just got ready for bed. I remember that I was walking to the bedroom that I was staying in when I heard my older brother Tony come inside and say that he saw a creepy guy standing outside the cabin. Everybody gathered around to the front window that looked outside the cabin to the front yard, and there he was. The same guy who I had seen in the woods was now standing in our front yard. He looked just as creepy as the first time I had seen him. He was wearing a dark-colored sweatshirt and what looked to be baggy and ripped. Jeans, the guy was just standing there facing our house. My dad said that he was going to go out and talk to the guy. He walked out the front door and I heard him call out to the man asking who he was and how he could help him. But almost right after my dad started to speak, the guy started running straight for him. My dad went back inside quickly and locked the door. The guy tried opening it and then started banging on the door. My dad luckily did have a cell phone back then and was able to get a signal. He used it to call the police. The guy kept banging at the door and after a while finally stopped and seemed to go off somewhere. It took a while for the police to arrive way out there, but they eventually did get there and searched the property and found the man hiding in the woods. I heard it again, a dragging sound, low and slow, like something was being pulled across the ground. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just a deer or some animal, but the noise kept coming closer, slowly making its way around the tent. I looked at my mom, who was still asleep next to me. I didn't want to wake her up and make her scared if it was nothing, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. Suddenly the tent moved. It wasn't a big movement, just a slight push, but enough to make my stomach twist. Whatever was out there had brushed against the side of the tent. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. I didn't move, just listening, waiting for it to happen again, but nothing happened for a while. Then, after what felt like forever, I heard soft footsteps, faint at first, then getting quieter as they moved back into the woods. I lay there, eyes wide open, not daring to close them again. I stayed like that until morning, listening to every little noise, waiting for it to come back, but it never did. By the time the sun came up, I had almost convinced myself. I imagined that maybe it was just the wind after all, or maybe I was dreaming and woke up in the middle of it. My mom didn't say anything about hearing noises, so I didn't bring it up. We spent the day fishing and hiking, but I couldn't shake this feeling that something wasn't right. Every time I looked at the trees, I felt like there were eyes on us, like someone or something was watching. But I kept quiet. I didn't want to scare my mom or ruin the trip. The second night, I barely slept. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow seemed bigger. I lay there with my eyes open most of the night, just waiting, but nothing happened. It was almost too quiet, and that made me even more nervous. When the morning came, I felt a wave of relief. We packed up quickly, eager to get out of there. As we loaded up the car, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Right outside where our tent had been, there were deep, long drag marks in the dirt. They led from the trees right up to our tent and then back into the woods. I didn't say anything to my mom, but I couldn't stop staring at those marks. They were way too big to be from any animal. I knew it looked like something heavy had been dragged around our tent in the middle of the night. Right when I heard those sounds, we left, and as we drove off, I kept looking back at the woods, expecting to see someone or something standing at the edge watching us go. But there was nothing. The trees looked empty now. Every time I think about that night, I feel a deep chill run down my spine. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just passing by. It had come right up to our tent, close enough to touch us, and it left without a trace. But the worst part, one can't stop wondering why it left, or if it'll come back the next time someone camps there. I decided to take my stepbrother Mark out for a camping trip. We were both excited about it. The plan was to head to a remote spot deep in the woods, far from other people. I thought it would be a good chance for us to bond and escape our busy lives. We got to the site in the early afternoon. It was a quiet, out-of-the-way place by a small lake surrounded by thick trees. The place was perfect, isolated, peaceful, and far from any other campers. We set up our tent, built a fire, and spent the evening cooking over it. The night was cool, but nothing too unusual. Around midnight, after Mark had fallen asleep, I was lying in the tent looking at the faint light of the lantern. The sounds of the forest were soothing, except for one thing, a steady, distant thud. It sounded like someone was hitting something or a muffled drum beat. At first I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just an echo or some animal, but as the hours went by, the sound got louder and more urgent. It was coming from the direction of the trees not far from our campsite. I tried to wake Mark, but he was deep in sleep, and shaking him only made him mumble, feeling more curious and uneasy. I decided to check it out. I grabbed a flashlight and Stepped outside. The night was dark, and the thing seemed to grow louder as I walked toward the forest. My flashlight cut through the darkness, casting creepy shadows on the trees. The thud was now mixed with a strange scraping noise. I moved carefully, shining my flashlight around. The noise seemed to come from near an old half-buried tree stump. As I got closer, I saw a broken wooden crate partly hidden under leaves and dirt. It was the source of the scraping sound. I was about to look closer when I noticed something strange about the crate. It was covered in what looked like dried mud and old blood. My heart raced. I felt a shiver down my spine as I realized this crate hadn't just been left here, it had been purposely hidden. I pulled at the crate, and it came loose with a groan. Inside there was a small rusty metal box. I hesitated, but finally opened it. Inside I found old photographs and personal items, most of them with people's faces scratched out or covered up. A chilling feeling washed over me. It was clear this box didn't belong here, and the stuff inside was deeply unsettling. I quickly closed the box and buried it again as best as I could, my mind racing with thoughts. I returned to the tent, trying to stay calm and not wake Mark. The next morning, I packed up our stuff, eager to leave the place. I didn't tell Mark about the crate. I thought it was better not to scare him. We left the campsite without any trouble, and the drive back was quiet. As I looked back at the forest from the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had uncovered something deeply disturbing. It wasn't just the crate or the strange noise, it was the unsettling thought that whatever was hidden in that box was meant to stay buried. The forest seemed to watch us as we drove away, like it was holding its breath, waiting for us to leave. I couldn't escape the sense that we had been watched, and that we had left something behind, something that didn't want to be found. The unease lingered long after we were gone, and I knew that whatever we had stumbled upon was still out there waiting in the shadows.